And it's ironic that this disease, which is spreading all over the Western world, is ignored completely by a fresh, new infusion of democracy that we are witnessing now in the Middle East and the Arab countries, where you have revolutions which are demanding democracy and freedom. So it's an interesting point. In terms of domestic policy, Obama carried on where he went back on a very clear promise he made, and in my book I outline it all the references are there. He had promised that at long last Americans would get a single-payer health system, i.e. the state would more or less take over the functioning of the health system and organize it. The attacks on him from the insurance companies and the pharmaceutical companies were so great that and so many Democrat and Republican senators and congressmen were on the payroll of these companies, that Obama, instead of fighting, going over their heads, addressing the American people as previous presidents had done, including Kennedy and Roosevelt, essentially decided to capitulate. And the woman who was drafted in to finally write the health bill was a woman who had worked for these insurance companies and was a leading lobbyist for them. She was actually drafted in to write the bill. So the health reform satisfied no one. And you know, if you look at the amount of money the United States spends on health, it is much, much greater than all the countries in Europe and Australia which have a health service which offers medicines to those who can't afford them free of charge. The United States spends so much more than that because it's paying the insurance companies and the pharmaceuticals. So their actual spending on health is huge, and the profits in this industry are huge, but the actual service is abysmal, absolutely abysmal. Then you take education. Here, seeing a crisis in the educational system, again, the instinctive response was a Reaganite response, which was, and here I'm going to quote, to go to the market. The problem with education is not that the state is not funding it adequately, that teachers are being put under enormous pressures to do things other than teach at the schools. The teachers in state schools, or public schools as they're known in the United States, are not being paid enough. So what is the solution to all this? How to revive the public education system? Sell it off. And the man responsible, Arne Duncan, one of Obama's close friends from Chicago, responsible for the privatization of many of Chicago's schools, and a veteran of the Chicago Democratic Party machine, was picked to run at the education system. Now, Duncan has only been to private schools. He has no experience of the state system, but he's a great believer in corporatizing education completely. His special academy, which he created when he was a stockbroker, was called the Ariel Community Academy, and it was set up by Ariel Capital Management. And the brochure for encouraging students to this academy, and you can imagine, as I read it out, who they were trying to attract, read as follows. We want to make the stock market a topic of dinner table conversation. I mean, it's bad enough discussing it in the stock market, but to bring it back home. What better way to teach kids than by gifting first graders with $20,000 to invest in a classroom stock portfolio? Each graduating class would return the original $20,000 to the new first grade and donate half the profits to the school, with the rest distributed among the graduates. It's not yet been revealed whether any of this money was invested in Madoff, in other Ponzi schemes, in Lehman Brothers, or various other dodgy outfits that exist and promise huge returns on capital. An Obama touch was provided that a voluntary extra class would take place after church each Sunday, where kids could learn how all this worked. This guy became CEO of Chicago's public schools. It wasn't enough. They then decided that some of the schools, these are the schools which I visited when I was in Chicago last summer, and they're the poorest schools with a large majority of people going to them from poor African American families. And some of these schools, Arne Duncan, backed by Obama, decided were to be made into naval and military academies, i.e. sold to the Navy and the Department of Defense, if you please. Why? He said, to offer the community more choice. Now, the only choice they would be offered after going to these academies was to join the Navy or the Army. And the reason they're doing this is very simple, that as an imperial power, when they fight wars, in the past they used to have conscription, which was, however many people hated it, and understandably, infinitely more democratic than any other system, that if you're fighting a war and you're a citizen and your country asks you, then either you resist, which lots of people did in the Vietnam days and more recently, or you go and fight. But the problem with conscription is that when it didn't work, as it didn't in the Vietnam days, because large numbers of middle and upper middle class kids who became anti-war activists after serving in Vietnam and came back and fought against the war, and the army suddenly found itself, the Pentagon, confronted with a demonstration of 500,000 people saying we want the Vietnamese to win. Well, that does prove problematic. And that means that conscription can have a sort of an opposite effect. So they stopped conscription after the Vietnam War. So the wars being fought in Iran and Iraq are being fought by who? Volunteers, largely from poor communities, who are promised various things if they join, but still more and more people, instead of are not being attracted to this because they know they'll go and die. So in order to encourage them, these schools are now being created in the poorest parts of the country, run by the military and the Navy, so that I'm sure one of the conditions will be, if we give you a free education, will you serve 3-4 years in the Navy or the Army? That's what the deal is bound to be, and thus make up for the lack of ordinary citizens joining the Army. And when ordinary citizens join it, you have to go and find mercenaries. And so these private armies have been created by private corporations, like Blackwater before it's changed its name to something else, who go and recruit ex-soldiers from all over the world to go and fight America's wars. That is what is happening, because the support they get from the vassal states in Europe and Australia are not enough. They can't do with that because it's not sufficient. They need their own standing army, and it's not working for them. So Obama made up for not having voted in favor of the Iraq war by escalating the war in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And it has wrecked, and it is wrecking that part of the world. And every single intelligence report that is being sent from Afghanistan to the leaders of the countries there says we can never win this war. We just can't win this war, so it's a question of how long are you going to stay in there, and what are you going to do before you get out? And I warned in a book I wrote a few years ago on Pakistan that Mark mentioned, that if you carry on fighting the war in Afghanistan, it is going to spill over into Pakistan, because The Pashtuns, who comprise the largest segment of the Afghan population, also live in Pakistan across the border created by the British, but never as a hard border. When the British were in India and subsequent Pakistani governments, they could never enforce a hard border because people on both sides spoke the same language. So if you were a Pashtun, you could cross the border without even showing your passport. No one challenged you or questioned you, and the reason for that is that you have a border here. You have Pashtun villages on this side, Pashtun villages on this side, literally overlooking the border. They come from the same tribes, they speak the same language, they intermarry, as is normal, and the border doesn't exist for them. So to try and impose this border by force creates problems. And obviously, when the tribes on this side are being attacked, they go to their relations on the other side, help us with food. So the war is now spread into Pakistan with disastrous results for that country and its social and political fabric. And conditions are getting worse each day. And this is not a tiny country. It's a country of 200 million people, and its military has nuclear weapons. It is a nuclear state. So to destabilize this country is suicidal. It's not simply short-sighted. And it's not just people like me who are saying this. Any serious American intelligence report, more or less in different ways, says the same thing. I was pleasantly surprised when the WikiLeaks erupted on the scene to see that the American ambassador Ann Patterson had sent a number of reports back to the State Department, more or less repeating all the arguments I'd made in my book. I'm not saying she read it, but it was interesting, the coincidence of arguments used, and I was quite pleased that there's some intelligence out there telling the people back home, don't do this. The country could collapse. So that is the situation in which we find the new president. And the wars abroad have continued. And so people get upset when you say that essentially the Obama regime is a continuation of the Bush regime, which was a continuation of the Clinton regime, which was a continuation of Bush the father's regime. That these are essentially governments which carry on what their predecessors have been doing. There has been no break with the previous administration. And what has annoyed venerable liberal Democrats like Gary Wills, who writes in the New York Review of Books, is the fact that on civil rights and civil liberties, on which Obama and his men and women said that they would really change, they would close down Guantanamo, they would end the state of exception, they would make it impossible to arrest people. Nothing's happened. Absolutely nothing's happened. And we read just, this week that this private Bradley Manning, locked up in an American military prison, is being tortured. And the reason he's being tortured is because they want him to confess that he sent the files, military files, to WikiLeaks and name Julian Assange. They want him to name Assange so they can extradite Assange from wherever he happens to be and try him in an American court for provoking dissent within the US armed forces. That's what's going on. Bradley Manning has been kept in solitary confinement, not allowed to see anyone. The first time a close friend was allowed to see him, he said he had completely changed. His personality was there. He's still not breaking. Walk into his prison cell after keeping him in confinement for days and just strip him naked for no rhyme or reason. Keep him naked, then put on clothes. It is a form of torture that is taking place there. Not a peep out of the Democrats, after all, who preside over the country and could stop it. And why do these people leak things? Why were the Pentagon Papers leaked? It always happens during times of war. The Pentagon Papers were released, revealed to the New York Times during the Vietnam War. And they had a huge impact. They confirmed many things we suspected. The WikiLeaks had been leaked at a time of America's wars in Iraq and Afghanistan by a young soldier who served in Iraq and saw with his own eyes what was happening to that country and what his